3 crimes from the late 1980s to the early 1990s in Melbourne, Victoria, Australia were linked and attributed to the person they dubbed in the Australian press as Mr. Cruel. The crimes were assaults against children. His identity was never discovered, but over the years many persons of interest have been speculated as the possible unknown identity who is the boogeyman Mr. Cruel. The first crime happened on the 22nd of August 1987 in Lower Plenty, a suburb of Melbourne, Victoria, Australia. A man wearing a balaclava broke into a family home at 4 a.m., armed with a knife and a gun. He tied the hands and feet of both parents and locked them in a wardrobe. He tied the son to a bed and raped the 11-year-old daughter. He had cut the phone lines. On December 27, 1988, in Ringwood, Melbourne, Australia, Mr. Cruel broke into a family home via the back door at about 5:20 a.m. armed with a handgun and wearing a balaclava. He bound and gagged the parents and demanded money. He grabbed their 10-year-old daughter Sharon Wills, put tape over her eyes and a ball gag in her mouth, and abducted her. She was released 18 hours later on the grounds of Bayswater High School. On the 3rd of July 1990 in Canterbury, Melbourne, Australia, Mr. Cruel broke into a family home at 11:30 p.m. armed with a knife and a gun and wearing a balaclava. He tied and gagged 13-year-old Nicola Linus, placed tape over her eyes, disabled the phones, and searched for money. He then drove her to another house and held her captive for 50 hours before releasing her at a power substation in the suburb of Kew in Melbourne, Australia. The 3 girls considered to be Mr. Cruel victims were sexually assaulted, and 2 of them were abducted and held captive at an unknown location and then released. The house Mr. Cruel took 2 of his victims to is considered on a flight path to Melbourne Airport because the victims described hearing planes fly overhead. On the 13th of April 1991, Carmaine Chan, a 13-year-old Chinese-Australian girl, was abducted from her home in Templestone, Melbourne, Victoria, Australia. On the day, Carmaine Chan was at home babysitting her 2 younger sisters while both her parents worked at Ying's, a Chinese restaurant they owned in the nearby Melbourne suburb of Eltham. The girls were confronted by a man in a balaclava with a knife, who forced Chan's sisters into a wardrobe before fleeing with Chan. Before leaving, the offender spray-painted Asian drug deal payback and more to come on a vehicle in the Chan's front yard. Police suspect this was a ruse to distract them from the killer's real motive. Chan's mother made an emotional plea on television for her daughter's return.
Release my daughter!
Carmaine Chan was to be believed to have been abducted by Mr. Cruel due to a similar modus operandi the perpetrator had to the other cases in Melbourne, Australia in the previous years. Unlike the other 2 previous victims, Carmaine Chan was not returned after she was abducted. She had been murdered and her remains were found on the 9th of April 1992 in a landfill area at Edgars Creek in the suburb of Thomastown. Her skull had 3 bullet holes in the back of the head. It has been speculated that Carmaine Chan may have seen her killer's face and that's why she was murdered. It's also been speculated Carmaine Chan's murder was not connected to the Mr. Cruel cases because the other victims were returned after their horrendous abduction ordeals. On the 14th of December 2010, the Mr. Cruel case was reopened.
Police say they have a new lead in their hunt for a notorious paedophile and killer who terrorised Melbourne in the late 80s and early 90s. They've never found the man they call Mr. Cruel, who's believed to have murdered 13-year-old Carmaine Chan and attacked at least 3 other schoolgirls. But now, after an exhaustive investigation, police say they have several new suspects. Kerry Ritchie reports.
It's the saddest of school photos. In 1991, Carmaine Chan was abducted from her home in the Melbourne suburb of Templestowe. The 13-year-old's body was found a year later. She'd been shot 3 times in the head. Carmaine Chan's killer was dubbed Mr. Cruel by a journalist, and it stuck, but he was never caught.
There were a number of young female victims that were abducted from their homes, assaulted, and that culminated in the final victim being Carmen Chan, where she was murdered.
15,000 people were interviewed in the largest investigation in Victoria's history. Now police have new information and have identified new suspects. They won't give any more detail, but say these people were not questioned 20 years ago.
The person who committed these crimes is in amongst our society, or was at the time of them. So he was associating with people, more than likely held a job down. So there is someone out there who has got information, we think, that hasn't been passed on.
For 20 years, Carmen Chan's mother has stayed in contact with senior police working on the case. Phyllis Chan didn't want to speak to journalists today and asked that her family's privacy be respected. Some officers who worked on the case believe Mr Krul may be dead or living in another country because his reign of terror ended suddenly. But Superintendent Doug Fryer says until that's confirmed, Victorian police won't rest and will not close the case.
I don't think Victoria's ever going to forget this series of crimes. They were that horrendous.
When speaking to his victims, Mr Krul used the terms bozo, worrywart and missy. Police hope these terms might trigger someone's memory. There is a $300,000 reward. Kerry Ritchie, ABC News, Melbourne.
On Monday, April 11, 2016, Victoria Police confirmed they were increasing the reward money for information that could lead to the arrest of Mr Krul to $1 million.
Murder terrified mothers and fathers. Mr Krul was a meticulous monster who crept into homes and stole children.
That's probably, when you think about it, every parent's nightmare.
25 years ago, Carmen Chan was kidnapped from Templestowe while she babysat her two younger sisters. A year later, her remains were found in Thomastown. The 13-year-old had been shot in the back of the head. It's believed the notorious paedophile had previously abducted 3 other girls.
The offender on all these occasions went to extremes to cover his identity and actually mentioned that his freedom was more important than the lives.
Over the last 2 decades, police have looked at 27,000 suspects, had more than 10,000 tip-offs and checked 30,000 homes. And while they've made 73 arrests, Mr Krul has never been identified. But police say, contrary to popular belief, they think he's still alive. Police are hopeful after 25 years that relationships between the killer and his family or friends may have changed. They're confident that someone who may not have been willing to talk in 1991 may be willing to do so now.
That there will be someone in the community who is an associate or knows the offender in this case will have information that's relevant to this investigation.
Chanel Vella, 10 Eyewitness News.
In 2020, retired homicide detective Ron Iddles revealed to the Australian true crime podcast Melbourne Marvels who he believed to be Mr Krul. According to Iddles, a well-known crook who was dying of cancer told Iddles in around 2003 that Mr Krul had lived in a house under the flight path in Eltham with a layout the same as described by victims, and was by that time deceased. According to Iddles, this person of interest was a successful businessman who frequented the Chan family restaurant and cross-dressed from time to time. On the 31st of April 2022, Herald Sun journalist Andrew Rule named Ron Iddles' informant as Alfred Hugh Gay and his suspect as Norman Leung Lee. Norman Leung Lee was a notorious armed robber who was shot dead by police during a botched robbery at Melbourne Airport in July 1992, just 3 months after the discovery of Carmen Chan's body. According to Andrew Rule, Norman Lee confessed to his associate Gay that he had murdered Carmen Chan. Gay also told Iddles that Lee had a collection of school dresses and owned a house in Napoleon Street, Eltham, with a converted garage that matched the description given by Sharon Wills and Nicola Linus. Iddles says he passed on the information to police, who showed a photograph of Lee to Phyllis Chan, but when she was unable to recognize him, it appears the police did not investigate further. Norman Leung Lee had first gained notoriety after being charged then discharged of the 1976 Great Bookie robbery. Interestingly, the first words of the masked bandits during the bookie robbery were, "We'll blow your heads off," a phrase also used by Mr. Cruel during the Linus abduction. Reddit user Elicra has also pointed out that Lee's partner in crime during the botched airport heist in July 1992 was Stephen Asling, who later used the same patch of wasteland beside Edgar's Creek in Thomastown where Carmaine Chan's body was found in April 1992, to bury Terrence Blewett in 2004. Is that just a coincidence? 30 years ago, Carmaine Chan's remains were discovered. The Mr. Cruel case is still active in 2022 and a new investigative strategy, a new lead and a new sketch was created this year. Hopefully the case is solved in the foreseeable future.